They called Miguel Salinas a mass killer. For most of his life, he was the quiet hand that kept West Texas oil flowing and cattle watered. On a July afternoon in 1987, a hairline crack hissed under a pasture fence, wetting dust and scaring a herd toward the road. Tank batteries sat close. One spark could have lit half a section. Miguel stepped from his truck. No hurry in his walk. He smelled crude under the hot wind, heard the change in pipe song, felt a faint tremor through his boot. Without a radio order, he shut one valve, then another, bleeding pressure around the brake before anyone upstairs even knew there was danger. Cows settled, the leak slowed. A near disaster vanished into heat shimmer. That calm, practiced mind would, weeks later, turn a pump station into a drowning room for 9 roughnecks and a landman who broke his trust. This is the story of how that happened. Where are you watching from? Tell it in the comments below. Evening settled on the lease road as Miguel drove back toward town, dust curling behind the truck in a tail. He passed pump jacks bowing their steel heads, some still moving, some frozen for months. At the highway turnoff, a billboard still bragged about boom-time jobs that no longer existed. He pulled into the only place that stayed bright after dark, the cafe everyone still called the diner, though the sign said restaurant now. Inside, air smelled of coffee, fried onions, and cigarette smoke trapped in the ceiling tiles. Roughnecks in stained coveralls leaned over chipped plates, talking low about layoffs, missing bonus checks, and bills that came whether the line ran or not. A waitress with tired eyes topped off Miguel's mug without asking. Years later, she would tell a reporter that he always tipped the same amount, even when his own hours shrank. Across the room, a younger crew watched the TV above the counter. An anchor in Houston talked about barrel prices crashing and another refinery cutting shifts. Those men didn't catch the finer points, but they understood what fewer shifts meant. Mortgage notes, past due notices tacked on fridges, hand-me-down shoes that had gone through 2 kids. West Texas wasn't just wide land, it was a narrowing lane for anyone earning by the hour. Miguel listened, not saying much. That was his way. He heard names of friends who'd been let go that week, heard which leases had gone quiet and which foremen were letting hot work go on to keep a little cash moving. The company preached safety at morning meetings, but everyone knew about the off-the-books tie-ins and backdoor barrel deals. Most times, nobody got hurt. That was how people justified it. At a back booth, half hidden by a fake potted plant, sat Harlan Pierce. He was dressed cleaner than the hands, neat boots, good belt, ironed shirt. A folder lay open between him and a skinny independent driller. Harlan's finger traced lines on a county map, stopping at ranch roads and dry draws. He laughed at something the other man said, shook his head, and then lowered his voice. The waitress, standing nearby, would later recall a few words. Cheaper route, don't need Houston. I know a guy who can place it right. Folks liked Harlan. He remembered birthdays, bought rounds when checks came in, and told stories about leases in New Mexico and Wyoming like he was spinning campfire tales. To most, he looked like a man trying to hustle up work in a bad year. Only the narrator and later the rangers would see that this was the place where he began turning Miguel's quiet skill into a side business. Near the cash register, the field supervisor, Ray Dobbs, was counting slips and grumbling about the new computer system Houston kept bragging about. The company had started wiring pump stations to a central screen, promising better safety and less waste. Ray didn't care about software, he cared about hours. Yet those green numbers and printer rolls would become the one unbiased witness to everything that followed. Miguel finished his coffee, nodded to the men he knew, and dropped his cash on the table. On his way out, Harlan caught his eye and raised a hand in greeting, easy smile in place. Miguel lifted 2 fingers in return, not stopping to chat. In that small passing moment, the foreman who knew every inch of buried line and the landman who knew every hungry lease shared a room, a town, and a future neither of them could have imagined ending in a flooded steel box. Night settled as Miguel left the diner and drove home. He turned off the highway and rolled past dark fields and quiet houses. Porch bulbs glowed over bare yards, lighting rusted cars and toys. Inside his cab, the radio murmured about prices and politics. He shut it off and listened to the engine knock and the hum of tires. At his place, a single yard light buzzed above a crooked mesquite. The house was small, paint peeling, roof patched with tin. It was still theirs. Teresa waited on the step, drying her hands on a towel. Javi sat beside her on the cooler, boots unlaced, face smudged. Supper smell drifted through the screen door, beans and fried potatoes. Miguel parked, climbed down, and nodded once. Teresa saw new lines on his face and dust on his shirt. She said nothing. She just stepped aside so he could enter. Inside, the kitchen felt close and warm. A box fan rattled in the window, pushing hot air around more than clearing it. They bowed their heads while Teresa said a short grace. Plates filled, forks scraped, and nobody talked much. Javi tried once, asking about a rig fire he had heard about, but Miguel only shook his head. The boy went quiet. He watched his brother's hands instead, steady even when tired. After the plates were empty, Miguel thanked Teresa for the meal. His voice was soft. He rinsed his dish, set it upside down on the rack, and walked out the back door. Javi almost followed, then stopped with his hand on the knob. He knew the shed time was private. Out under the yard light, Miguel crossed bare dirt toward a low building made from old tin and rough boards. Inside the shed, the air smelled of oil, dust, and mouse droppings. A single bulb hung from a wire, casting weak yellow light over tools and coiled hose. Against the back wall sat a metal box with a tiny brass lock. It looked like it ought to hold wrenches. It held the Salinas future instead. Miguel took a key from his wallet and turned it. The lid lifted with a sticky squeal. Inside lay rolled papers, tied with old string, edges browned from years of summer heat and winter chill. Ignacio Salinas had drawn them by hand at the kitchen table long before the company wired stations to screens. He had walked fence lines, watched floodwater carve new channels, and marked safe crossings in pencil. Springs, solid ridges, bad clay, all lined out in his slow, careful script. To any stranger, they were only old ranch maps. To Miguel, they were his father's voice flattened on paper, a pattern for how to lay steel without fighting the land. Over the years, Miguel had added his own marks to those sheets. Thin blue pen showed where pump jacks now stood. Red ink traced routes the company chose, often matching Ignacio's lines exactly. In some corners, computer printouts were taped beside the pencil curves, early flow reports with numbers Miguel cared about. He was no trained engineer, yet he could glance at land, paper, and figures and see the easiest path. The bosses praised his gut, never asking what lay behind it. Javi thought it was some kind of gift. Miguel knew better. It was work, and it was all he had to hand down. No savings account waited for them, no college fund. Just this pattern, this way of reading ground and gauges. He believed nobody outside the bloodline would ever dare steal it. That belief would not last. Before he left the shed, Miguel checked the lock on the metal box one more time. Ignacio's lines lay inside, rolled tight, smelling of dust and pencil. That pattern had guided every big choice he had made as a foreman. He believed the box and the blood tie around it were shield enough. With that thin comfort, he crossed the yard, kicked off his boots, and tried to sleep. Dawn would bring another day of company work laid over his father's quiet map. Near the fence sat the mapping trailer. a faded white rectangle with 2 metal steps. Inside, walls were papered with county grids and ranch plats, maps taped on top of maps until no bare panel showed. A small fan hummed in the corner. On the folding table lay rolled blueprints, a box of colored pins, and the gray plastic case of the new computer unit Houston bragged about. Across that cramped space, Harlan seemed perfectly at home. He leaned on the table, telling a joke that made the survey tech laugh hard enough to cough. When Miguel stepped through the door, Harlan's smile widened. "There's my guide," he said, tapping the table. "Sit down, partner. Help me keep these boys out of trouble." Miguel nodded once and set his worn folder by the blueprints. The job that morning looked simple. A feeder line had to slip between 2 ranches where owners were already angry about torn pasture and leaking gates. The company wanted less surface damage and a cheaper dig. Harlan unrolled the official survey map, its straight lines marching across square sections. Miguel added his own sheet beside it, copied from Ignacio's work. His line bent and curved, following ridges, crossing dry washes where rocks sat close, steering clear of low spots that turned to rivers in spring. For half an hour they worked like they always had. Harlan asked about soil, rock, and water. Miguel answered in short phrases, tracing points with a calloused finger. When they finished, Harlan gathered the loose sheets. "Let me clean this up for the file," he said lightly. "I'll run your path through the copier, make sure the bosses see you saved them money." Miguel hesitated, then let his hand fall away. Field calls pulled him out before lunch. When he finally walked back past the mapping trailer late in the day, orange light cut across the glass. Something on the inner wall caught his eye and stopped him in the doorway. A fresh route map hung there, smooth and bright, pinned at the corners. The heading named a small private drilling outfit, not the main company. Colored flags marked future wells like confetti. At first glance, it looked like any other plan. Then he saw the bends. The line on that page dipped between the same 2 dry creek beds his father had drawn. It slid along the same rise, eased past the same bad clay pan, crossed the wash at the only solid spot for miles. Above the map, in neat blue ink, someone had written, "Prelim Route Concept, H. Pierce." No mention of Salinas, no hint that another man's dead hand had guided those curves. Years later, that sheet and Miguel's own overlay would lie side by side in a cardboard box in Houston, tagged as evidence. On that late afternoon, they were just paper. Yet standing in the stale air of that crowded trailer, Miguel understood that his family's way of seeing the land had been lifted and offered for sale. The belief that no outsider would ever dare do it ended there, in silence. Miguel stayed in the doorway of the mapping trailer longer than anyone saw. The fan ticked. The new map flapped at one corner from its own weight. On paper, Harlan's name sat where his father's should have been. No one else in that cramped room knew they were looking at a stolen pattern. Miguel did. He pressed his lips together, then stepped back into the heat without a word. Sleep did not fix it. By morning, the image of that neat blue heading still hung in his mind, brighter than the sunrise over the flats. Miguel drove past Pump Station 17 on the way to the yard, watching the tanks and pipes slide by his window. These had always been his father's lines in his head. Now another man's initials sat on them in ink. In the yard office, Ray Dobbs sat behind a metal desk stacked with work orders. A boxy computer terminal shared space with a yellowed calendar and a jar of pens that did not write. Ray rubbed his temples while he read a bulletin from Houston about process improvements. He looked up when Miguel knocked, saw the set of his shoulders, and sighed. Got a problem on that feeder line route. Map in your trailer for a private job uses my daddy's pattern. Harlan put his name on it. Ray leaned back, chair creaking. He knew Miguel was not a man to stir trouble over nothing. At the same time, he knew Houston did not care whose pencil had traced a curve, so long as the right-of-way stayed cheap. Ray opened a drawer, pulled out a blank incident form and set it between them. If you want it on record, write it down. I'll send it up with the rest. Miguel picked up the pen. The ball stuck, then rolled. He wrote plain words about a route for an outside outfit, a pattern taken from an older family map, and a partner who had not asked. He did not mention Ignacio by name. He did not speak of honor. Paper did not have spaces for that. Ray read the lines, nodded once, and signed his own name at the bottom. Later, that memo would sit in a file drawer until a ranger pulled it with gloved hands. On that day, it went into a thin folder marked MISC. Ray shrugged. Roots follow land, Miguel. Can't claim a creek bed, you know that. Houston's lawyers sure know it. I'll send this, but don't expect fireworks. Miguel walked out into the glare, the door bumping closed behind him. For a moment he stood by the row of company trucks, smelling hot rubber and diesel, hearing a radio crackle from the open bay. The rules he had trusted all his working life felt thin. If the company could not see the theft and the law would not name it, then no formal thing would guard Ignacio's lines. The only tools left were the same ones he used on night calls: wrenches, valves, and now the new computers that watched every gallon move. That night, at his kitchen table after Teresa and Javi slept, Miguel opened a cheap spiral notebook. On the first line he wrote the date and father's map. On the second, he wrote the small outfit's name and the crew boss tied to Harlan's new route. He was not planning a lawsuit. He was building his own record. If the law would not guard that pattern, he would trust steel, ink, and the company's new logs to remember for a while. Hours slipped by at the kitchen table while Miguel bent over the spiral notebook. He was not a man of long sentences, so he used short lines and numbers. Names tied back to jokes in the diner or a handshake at the yard. Next to the first small outfit's name, he wrote a note, route same as father. When ink began to blot, he shut the book and laid his hand on the cover. The choice sat there, thin as cardboard and heavy as steel. For the first time, he thought about using the line itself to push back. Before the sun came up, he was at the yard. The air tasted like dust and coffee grounds. A new printer sat under the wall clock. White paper fed out in slow jerks, rows of numbers tracking how much crude moved through each segment of pipe, flow in, flow out, pressure at every station. The night operator, half asleep, barely looked up as Miguel stepped in. "Forgot to grab last night's log," Miguel said. The man shrugged and tore off a copy. Miguel folded it and slid it under his clipboard. On his lunch break, he sat alone in his truck, doors open to catch any breeze. Grease-stained fingers smudged the log sheet as he traced the column for a small lateral line. The numbers did not match what he knew from the field. That stretch should have been quiet. Instead, it showed extra barrels, small but steady. A hot tap dressed up as normal flow. Harlan's promises in the diner had already turned into hidden production. Miguel wrote the timestamps into his notebook. The paper did what Ray and Houston would not. It told the truth without caring who got hurt. Out along the right-of-way 2 days later, Miguel parked near a sagging fence and walked down into a shallow draw. The steel under his boots still belonged to Pump Station 17's reach. He checked a gauge, wiped dust from the glass, and listened to the slow rush inside the line. Up the slope, Javi waited by the truck, kicking stones. Miguel opened a small valve by hand, counted under his breath, then closed it halfway.
That small move would send a short, sharp surge of pressure down toward the secret tie-in he had seen in the numbers. Downstream at the hot tap, 3 men worked in a narrow cut they had no permit to dig. Their pipe ran from the company line to a row of rusted tanks. They joked and did not watch the gauge. When the surge came, it lifted muddy water and oil in a sudden roar. One man slipped, hit his shoulder on the metal ladder, and cursed as a spray soaked his shirt and hard hat. Tools clanged, a weld cracked. No one died, but everyone understood they had been hit by something bigger than a loose wrench. When the paperwork caught up, it landed on Ray's desk as a maintenance ticket and an incident form. Unexplained pressure jump at unauthorized connection, a field note read in shaky 10. Ray scrawled a warning about safety and wrote up the crew boss, never guessing that Miguel had stood on a slope miles away and turned that valve. Years later, rangers would pull that form and slide it into a stack marked pattern. For Miguel, the moment came sooner. As he read a copy of the ticket on the shop wall, he knew the line could be used as a switch. Once flipped, it could reach into cuts and touch men who thought nobody was watching.
That knowledge sat on Miguel's shoulders all day. He pictured the soaked crew, men swearing in a trench they'd cut for quiet cash. Nobody had died, yet he'd reached them with a twist of steel miles away. The line had become a switch he could flip. After the shift, pickups rolled out of the yard. Heat shimmered above the cracked asphalt. Miguel was hanging his hard hat on its nail when the office phone rang. Ray answered, frowned, then waved him over. "Pierce," was all he said, hand covering the mouthpiece. On the line, Harlan tried for his usual easy tone, but it shook. He wanted to meet someplace quiet, out by an old stock pond on a back lease road. "Got paperwork we should look at," he said. "Don't want to spook anyone." Miguel agreed. The choice already sat inside him. That pond lay in a shallow bowl of land, ringed with scrub and a few tired trees. Brown water held a faint oil sheen from old spills. Years later, the sheriff's report would call it an accident, and the record ticket would list "vehicle submerged in stock tank." On this evening, only 2 men knew better. Miguel got there first. He parked near the fence and watched dust rise on the far ridge as a second truck dropped toward the bowl. Harlan climbed out with a leather briefcase and a beer can, using the drink as cover in case anyone drove by. No joke came this time. Harlan set the briefcase on his tailgate and popped the latches. Inside were folded maps, copied plats, and neat stacks of forms with his initials on the bottom. A fresh route plan lay on top, its colored line following the same bends Ignacio had traced decades earlier. Harlan talked fast. He said the big company was cutting hours, that small outfits would pay good money for smart routes. He admitted he was in debt, house on the line, kids he wanted out of this town. "You point? Ideal. Nobody loses, Mike. We just take what they won't pay us." Listening, Miguel felt years of shared miles press in. He heard Teresa washing dishes in his mind, saw Javi looking up to him in the yard. He pictured Ignacio hunched at the table, drawing ridges by lamplight. That map was all they had. Harlan had turned it into side money. The memo Miguel had filed with Ray meant nothing. No lawyer would stand up and call a routing curve stolen. If he walked away now, the old code he'd grown up with left him one answer. They left the tailgate and wandered down toward the water, boots sliding in loose dirt. To anyone watching from the road, it would have looked like 2 tired men stretching their backs. Sunlight turned the surface copper. Miguel stepped a little closer than needed. What followed was short. A shove, a slip, the heavy splash of a grown body hitting shallow water. Harlan came up once, gasping and clawing at mud. Miguel watched, jaw tight, boots rooted on the bank. He could have grabbed a wrist. He did nothing. When the struggle stopped, ripples smoothed and flies came back to the shore.
Miguel walked up to the truck, hands steady. He closed the briefcase, wiped mud from the latch, and set it on his own seat. Maps, discs, and signed side deals now rode with him, a paper trail he would one day lay at the state's feet, even as it condemned him. The pond kept its secret.
Miguel drove away from the pond with the briefcase on the seat beside him. Mud dried on his cuffs. The wheel felt slick under his hands. In the mirror, dust swallowed the low bowl of land and the dull shine of the water. The tank now held one more secret under its skin. At home, Teresa saw the set of his jaw and said nothing. She noticed the extra shadows under his eyes, the way he flinched when Javi mentioned Harlan's name in passing. Miguel carried the briefcase to the shed without a word. Under the hanging bulb, he opened it and spread the contents on the workbench. Maps, lease forms, and typed lists filled the space. Some sheets bore the main company letterhead. Others carried logos of small outfits Miguel knew only from diner talk. The same curved routes appeared again and again, hugging dry creek beds and skirting clay pans, just as Ignacio had taught him. Names of roughnecks and foremen were scribbled in the margins, along with promises of bonus barrels and off-book runs. He took out his spiral notebook and began copying. Each outfit name earned a line. Next to it, he wrote the crew boss, then the hands listed in Harlan's notes. Beside that, he added a simple mark that only he understood, a small cross when the route matched his father's pattern. The page filled fast. The network was wider than he had guessed. More men than he knew were already eating off Ignacio's map without ever hearing the old man's name. Word of Harlan's accident came 2 days later. A deputy knocked at the yard office, hat in his hands, asking when anyone had last seen the landman. By evening, talk spread that his truck had gone into a tank. The sheriff's report would later show skid marks fading into water, beer cans in the cab, and a cause box checked driver error. The pond kept its story simple. The funeral home smelled of flowers and old carpet cleaner. Soft organ music played from worn speakers. Men in best shirts shifted in folding chairs, while women whispered in the hall. Miguel stood near the back with Javi, hat in his hand. Up front, Harlan's wife sat stiff, hands knotted in her lap. Beside her, 2 grown sons stared at the closed casket, faces tight with anger and grief. A line of people moved past a small table to sign the guest book. Miguel waited his turn. When the pen reached him, he wrote Salinas in block letters and stepped aside. As he moved, he caught pieces of talk. One son spoke about Dad's root system and how they would keep it going. A cousin mentioned new work tied to Pierce grids already on the books. To them, the pattern on those maps was a ticket out of debt, a way to hold on to trucks and mortgages. Javi watched Miguel's jaw clench. The younger brother did not know details, but he felt the heat under that still face. For the first time, he wondered if the code they had been raised with might bend a man until it broke him. Later that week, the yard's small computer room hummed after hours. Green text glowed on a black screen. The new system could call up project files and contact lists from Houston. Miguel sat alone, Harlan's discs stacked beside the terminal. He slid one into the drive and waited while the machine chattered. Then names filled the display. Contractors, survey crews, roughnecks, each tied to a job number and a route. He printed the lists, page after page, and spread them on the table. With a red pen, he circled every crew that matched entries in his notebook. The network now lived in 2 places, his handwritten ledger and the company's own records. As he capped the pen, he thought of the wives in black dresses and the boys in stiff collars at the funeral home.
Every circle on those pages meant a house that might one day carry a folded flag or a foreclosure notice. Doubt passed through him like a cold draft, then settled somewhere deep where it could not stop his hands. By the time dawn lit the yard the next day, the cold inside Miguel had hardened into a kind of calm. Doubt was still there, but it no longer reached his hands. He walked into the office with his clipboard like any other foreman starting any other shift. The dispatcher sat at a metal desk, radio hissing behind him, a stack of blank work orders at his elbow. On the wall, a chart showed every crew and station in the district. Miguel studied it as if weighing normal assignments. Then he pointed to Pump Station 17. "Need a safety refresh out there," he said. "Night session, full crew." The dispatcher grumbled about overtime. Miguel answered that Houston wanted better paperwork on confined space training. It was the kind of phrase that ended arguments. The man filled out the order, reading off names as he wrote. 9 Roughnecks, all familiar, all circled in red back in Miguel's notebook. Each one had touched or spread Harlan's stolen routes. Toward late afternoon, clouds began to stack on the horizon, blue-black over the flat land. Miguel drove ahead of the others, taking the narrow caliche road that wound to Station 17. The place sat in a shallow dip, tanks and pipes painted dull company gray. A chain-link fence wrapped the yard. Beyond it lay a dry drainage channel that ran fierce with runoff in wet years. As he unlocked the gate, wind carried the smell of metal and distant rain. Inside the control room, lights flickered on with a buzz. Panels lined the walls, each sprouting gauges and switches. A small printer, same model as the one in the yard office, blinked to life, waiting to spit out records of every change. Miguel stood in that tight, humming space for a long moment. He could hear Ignacio's soft voice in memory, talking about how water always found the low places. Machines, he told himself now, also followed paths. Once he turned them, logs would keep quiet, accurate notes on whatever he did. He walked the station step by step. At one valve, he opened a quarter turn. At another, he closed halfway, testing how fast water would fill the lowest rooms if the pumps ran long. A ladder in the sump area had always wobbled. He gave it one more hard shake, then left it that way. At each move, he checked that indicator lights changed and that numbers on small screens flicked in response. The printer tapped and whirred, marking time in rows of figures. Later, rangers would match those shifting digits to his path through the building. In a narrow service alcove off the main hall, an old steel toolbox sat under a workbench. Paint peeled from its lid. Most days it held spare gaskets and rags. Miguel had cleared it out the week before. Now he placed the original Salinas map inside, along with his spiral notebook and several of Harlan's copied grids. On top he laid a single sheet, handwritten, stating whose pattern ran through those lines and naming the 9 men he had called for training. He closed the lid and snapped the latches. The key he slid up into a crack in the framing, where a patient searcher might one day find it. Outside, air grew heavy. First drops of rain dotted the dust, leaving dark coins that spread and joined. Miguel walked the perimeter, checking gates and doors, then returned to the control room and watched clouds through the small window. The clock on the wall crept toward evening. His work order said the session began at 7. That gave him time to bring the line into the exact state he'd chosen. He started one pump, shifted a set of valves, and listened as water began to move with new intent. Headlights brushed the far rise just after sunset. A pair of trucks appeared first, then more, bouncing down the road in single file. Engines grew louder, cutting through the steady thrum of the pump. Miguel stood very still, feeling the floor vibrate under his boots as 9 vehicles rolled up to the fence and their drivers stepped out into the rising wind.
Gray light settled over Pump Station 17 as the rain finally backed off. Mud sucked at boots and tires. A call had gone out before sunrise. Multiple men missing, trucks still at the gate. Deputies rolled up first, then Ray's company pickup, then the volunteer fire engine from town, red paint streaked with dust. At the fence line, 9 vehicles sat in a crooked row, windows fogged, doors locked. Hard hats lay on dashboards, lunchboxes and thermoses waited on seats. The chain on the gate hung snapped and twisted. Beyond it, the yard looked still except for the steady rush of water in the drainage channel. No one answered shouts. Firemen and roughnecks together moved in, carrying ropes and backboards. The concrete steps down to the lower pump room vanished under brown water. An oily sheen floated on top. The smell of wet steel, crude, and something sweet turned a few stomachs. One volunteer muttered that the place felt wrong, like a basement after a storm. When they finally spotted the first hard hat bumping against the far wall, the scene shifted from search to recovery. Hooks snagged clothing under the surface. Bodies came up heavy and limp, faces pale, lungs ballooning like drowned flags. Men on the bank looked away or swore under their breath. Some knew these roughnecks by name. One had lent a socket set to a man they now laid in the mud. Down at the county, the medical examiner, Dr. Ellis, had just started her coffee when the call came. She drove out with a deputy, past fields where puddles shone in wheel ruts. At the site, she pulled on gloves and knelt beside each lined-up shape under a slick tarp. Quick checks showed bruises and cuts from bouncing off walls and ladders, but no gunshot wounds, no knife marks. Lungs felt full. To her, it looked like drowning, plain but brutal. Company men kept close. Among them stood a thin engineer from Houston named Tom Klein. He wore a hard hat too new for the yard and glasses fogged by the damp. While deputies worked the scene, Tom's eyes stayed on the station doors and the valves above the flooded steps. He had helped design parts of this layout on paper. It was not supposed to look like this. Inside the control room, alarms that should have screamed were quiet. Indicator lights glowed in odd patterns. Tom found a clipboard with last week's normal settings and held it beside the panel. One by one, he checked valve positions against standard. This pump should have been on bypass. That gate should have been cracked, not closed. Another should not have been touched at all during a safety talk. Yet every switch sat in a place that, taken together, forced water into the lowest chamber and held it there. He took out a pencil and drew a simple sketch on the back of a work order. Rectangles for tanks, circles for valves, arrows for flow. He shaded the ones now set wrong and wrote the exact numbers from the dials beside them. The pattern made sense only if someone had walked through with a plan. Broken equipment could not have done this. Outside, Dr. Ellis finished her first look and gave the sheriff a quiet list. 9 adult males, all apparently drowned within the same rough hour. No sign they'd made it out of the pit. No tire tracks showing some wild flood had swept through from upstream. Whatever filled that room had come from the system, not the sky. By mid-morning, yellow tape fluttered in the wet wind. Families began to gather at the roadblock, faces drawn, trying to see past cruisers and trucks. In the mud by the drainage channel, one deputy stared at the long skid mark where water had rushed over concrete, then back at the still pumps. He did not yet have words for what he felt, only a hard knot in his gut. What Tom carried back to the office that day, his rough valve sketch and the notes on impossible settings, would later sit beside Dr. Ellis's first report in a Ranger case file. Together, they turned what might have been called a freak accident into the first hint of a pattern. Someone had used the line itself to trap 9 men in a room with only one way for water to go. By noon, the county sheriff had called in the Texas Rangers. A tan sedan rolled up to the tape, and Lt. Karen McCready stepped out, hat low against the wet wind. She walked the site once in silence, eyes on valves, doors, and the row of trucks. Her gut said this was no act of God. Inside the small office trailer, she spread Tom Klein's rough valve sketch beside Dr. Ellis's early notes. The drawing showed every switch that should have been open but sat closed, every bypass shut that should have bled pressure away. A hand had moved through this place on purpose, and that hand knew the system. Before sunset, she rode with Tom to the company's central control room in town. A glass wall overlooked rows of green glowing screens and humming printers. Every station piped numbers into this room: pressures, flows, alarms, resets. Karen asked for the logs from Pump Station 17 for the last week, plus any phone records tied to it. Technicians printed stack after stack of flow reports, each line marked with time and valve code. Another clerk pulled telephone switchboard slips, listing every call in or out of the station. Together, they built a paper trail of the night the men went under and of the days before when someone had practiced with smaller surges. Patterns stood out fast to a trained eye. On one sheet, a brief spike on a lateral line matched the maintenance ticket from the soaked hot tap crew. On another, a series of odd adjustments lined up with the night Harlan's truck went into the pond. The same operator code appeared near each cluster of changes. That code belonged to Miguel Salinas. He was known as the man who could calm a leak before alarms even triggered. He also filed the forgotten routing pattern tied to Harlan's name. Karen read the memo twice, then placed it beside the phone logs that showed late-night calls between the two men. Investigations rarely jump straight to one villain. Karen sketched a 3-column list on her pad: mechanical failure, labor revenge, outside saboteur. Under each heading, she wrote reasons and doubts. Bolts had not snapped, pumps had not blown. Unions were weak here, and no one had claimed a cause. One name, however, lay under every column. Miguel's record painted a split picture. Safety awards, commendations, and quiet praise from ranchers lined his file. Old notes spoke of leaks prevented and cattle saved. Yet his operator code sat at the heart of every unexplained surge and every strange valve pattern. If this was crime, it was done by someone who loved the system too well. Back at the motel that night, Karen taped maps and printouts on the wall above the little desk. Red pen linked Station 17, the hot tap site, the stock pond, and several small leases using Harlan's private grids. The same curved routes Ignacio had drawn now looked to an outsider like the spine of a murder case reaching across the county. Calls went out the next morning to Houston Legal, to the company's safety office, and to the sheriff. Karen requested one more set of logs, this time pulling years back, and asked that Miguel report for a formal interview. The paper had started as raw numbers and dull memos. Under her pen, it was turning into a story with one central figure. For now, she wrote 3 letters beside his name: P.O.I., Person of Interest. It was a label for a man whose neighbors called him the steadiest hand on the line. Word that the Rangers had a person of interest moved through the town faster than any truck. First, it was just a murmur at the grocery store and the post office. By the weekend, the local paper put it in print. A small front-page story named Miguel Salinas as the veteran foreman whose operator code sat under key valve changes the night 9 men drowned. It also mentioned, in careful language, an old complaint he had filed about stolen map work. On the inside page, an unsigned editorial went further. It asked what kind of company ignored a warning about intellectual theft from one of its own hands, then left the same man in charge of a station with bad alarms and poor escape routes. It quoted unnamed field sources who said side deals had grown common during the bust and that a landman had been pushing a special routing method that looked a lot like Salinas family land notes. Saturday night, copies of that paper lay folded on the bar at the VFW hall. Neon beer signs painted the walls in soft colors. A jukebox hummed in the corner, turned low so folks could talk. Old men in caps marked with unit patches sat next to younger hands, still in work boots. Some had worked under Miguel, some had drunk with the dead Roughnecks. All of them had an opinion, and none of them felt simple. Near the middle of the room, a cluster of workers' and widows' cousins argued over the same sheet of newsprint. One man jabbed a finger at Miguel's name and said it proved he was a cold killer who planned the drownings like a war move. Another shook his head and asked why nobody talked about the theft that came first, or the years Miguel had kept cows and kids safe with the same knowledge people now feared. At one end of the bar, Javi nursed a beer that had gone warm. He had worked beside some of the drowned men, had shared lunches and traded shifts. Their faces rose every time someone said 9. Hearing his brother's name spoken in anger cut in a way he had not expected. Yet hearing people praise Miguel as a kind of outlaw hero felt wrong too. Those widows still had to bury husbands. His family still had to live here. Behind the counter, the bartender slid fresh bottles across the wood and kept a quiet eye on the clock. Later, his penciled bar tab sheet for that date would show a spike in sales, a long list of names who stayed past closing time while talk circled the same man and the same map. On that night, though, all he saw was a room split between folks who believed Miguel had done what any man with pride would do, and folks who swore no code excused 9 dead. Back at the tiny newspaper office, the editor watched the bar from across the street and made a note to follow up. His piece had only hinted at the technical side of the story, but it had done its job. People now linked 3 things in their minds: a drowned crew, a stolen family routing style, and a stack of company logs that seemed to back Miguel's warning. That link, once formed, would be hard for any lawyer or executive to break. In the weeks ahead, that early editorial and the scribbled bar tab became small but telling exhibits in the case file. Markers showing exactly when a private grudge turned into a public story nobody could ignore. Dawn came thin and pale over the Salinas place the morning the law arrived. Teresa heard engines before she saw lights. 2 county cruisers stopped by the ditch, then a tan sedan with a star on the door. Doors opened. Boots hit gravel. Javi stepped out onto the porch, heart pounding. Lieutenant Karen McCready walked up the path, hat low, coat damp with old rain. A deputy held a folded paper in his hand. Miguel stood already in the yard, work shirt buttoned, boots tied, as if he'd dressed for a shift. He had slept little, but his face looked calm. Karen read the warrant out loud. Suspicion of murder, multiple counts, tied to Pump Station 17 and the death of Harlan Pierce. Legal words hung in the air. Teresa's fingers dug into the porch rail. Javi felt the world tilt. Miguel only nodded once. He did not argue about rights or guilt. Instead, he asked one plain question. "You got somewhere safe for evidence?" Karen, surprised, said they did. The sheriff's office kept a locked room for important things. Miguel said there was a box they needed to see. "Out at 17, he added. "Steel, under a bench. It's got what you're looking for." The drive to town was quiet. Miguel rode in the back of a cruiser, hands cuffed in front. He watched fields slide by, the same lines he had traced with pipe. Javi followed in his own truck,
knuckles white on the wheel, refusing to let his brother vanish into the system alone. Teresa stayed on the porch until dust settled, then went inside to sit at the table where Ignacio once drew maps. At the sheriff's office, Karen signed Miguel into a small interview room. Cinderblock walls, single metal chair, table bolted to the floor. A tape recorder sat between them, little red light blinking. When she asked if he understood the charges, he said yes. When she asked if he wanted a lawyer, he said he would later. For now, he wanted the record straight. He told her about Ignacio's hand-drawn map, about Harlan's copied routes, about the memo Ray had filed and the side taps nobody wanted to see. He did not soften what came next. He walked her through each valve at Station 17, each pump he started, each switch he set. He named the 9 men on the safety list and said in a flat voice that he had known they would not walk out. Karen listened, pen scratching, eyes steady. She had heard confessions full of rage and tears. This one sounded like someone describing a long job done right. When he finished, he pointed to the tape recorder. "That box at 17, he said, has my daddy's map, my notes, and Pierce's grids. You match 'em to your logs, you'll see why I broke." A deputy took her back to the cruiser. They drove to the station with a spare key from the company and a bolt cutter, then straight into the quiet building. The lower rooms still smelled faintly of mud and loss. In the service alcove, under a workbench, sat the steel toolbox Miguel had described, paint peeling, latches rusted but firm. They carried it unopened to the sheriff's evidence room. Under bright fluorescent light, Karen snapped on gloves, read the tag on the lid in Miguel's neat hand, and broke the lock. Inside lay rolled pencil maps, the spiral notebook, and several folded company grids marked Pierce. On top, a single page listed 9 names and a line tying them to unauthorized use of Salinas pattern. Each item received its own tag and bag. Chain of custody forms added another layer to the trail Miguel had started with his notebook and the company logs. He had turned himself in and at the same time locked his story into the official record. By afternoon, Miguel sat in a holding cell, orange jumpsuit replacing denim, his authority on the line gone. Yet in the shelves 1 floor below, his father's map and the evidence of theft rested in state-stamped plastic. The man the town once trusted now waited behind steel bars, while the system he never trusted prepared to carry his truth forward along with his guilt. On a clear fall morning, the county courthouse filled before the doors opened. Farmers in pressed shirts, widows in black, roughnecks with scrubbed hands, and a few big city reporters all lined the steps. The trial of Miguel Salinas was the biggest case the county had seen in years. Inside, ceiling fans turned above worn benches. The judge watched from a high seat, flag behind him. At one table sat the state, folders stacked neat. At the other sat Miguel with a public defender, thinner now, chains fastened at his ankles under the table. Prosecutors told the jury a simple story. A trusted foreman, angry over a business slight, had turned Pump Station 17 into a death trap. They said he knew every weak point and used that knowledge to flood a room and drown 9 workers, then staged a landman's death at a stock tank. They leaned on words like cold and planned and pointed to maps, logs, and Miguel's own taped talk. The defense did not fight the valves or the bodies. Instead, they tried to place a longer line behind that one awful night. They spoke of Ignacio's kitchen table, of pencil lines tracing dry creeks and safe crossings. They laid out Miguel's war record, his years of clean safety sheets, and the memo he filed when he saw his family pattern under Harlan's name. They argued that the company's indifference and Harlan's theft did not excuse murder, but they asked the jury to see why a quiet man snapped. Evidence days turned the room into a slow classroom. Jurors saw flowcharts from normal weeks at Station 17 and from the night of the drownings. On big boards, colored lines showed pressure climbing at impossible rates, dropping only when the lower room filled. Each move carried a timestamp and one operator code. It was Miguel's. Lieutenant Karen McCready then walked the jury through objects that tied those spikes to motive. First came the old complaint about stolen roots. Next came the steel toolbox, opened in the sheriff's office, holding Ignacio's penciled map, the spiral notebook, and Pierce-marked company grids. Overlays showed the Pierce roots lying almost exactly on the Salinas pattern. Finally, thick binders of SCADA logs matched Miguel's own taped account, nearly line for line. Ray Dobbs had to admit on the stand that he had filed Miguel's warning and never pushed it. Harlan's widow spoke of a system her husband said would carry their sons. Widows of the drowned spoke of house notes, school clothes, and late-night trips to a station they thought was safe. The pain on each side sat in the same room as the charts and binders. By the time lawyers gave closing arguments, two truths sat side by side. One, a man walked through a station and turned water loose on 9 others with no path out. Two, that same man watched his father's work taken, saw the company shrug, and believed nothing short of his own hand would stop the theft. After a day behind a closed door, the jury returned. Miguel was found guilty on every count of murder tied to Pump Station 17 and to Harlan's death. They chose life terms over death, citing his service record and full confession. The judge read out multiple life sentences with no parole for decades. When the gavel fell, Miguel became inmate Salinas in the eyes of the state. That same week, the State Oil and Gas Board released a brief notice. It fined the company for poor design and ignored complaints, flagged Pierce-style routes for review, and told operators to tighten oversight on side taps. Landowners' lawyers filed civil suits that named the stolen grid and the Salinas map as key exhibits, sealing Miguel's story into law books as well as local memory. As this courtroom chapter closes, take a breath. If you're still watching, consider subscribing so you can follow what happened to the families and the town in the years after the verdict.
The day after sentencing, chains rattled as guards led Miguel down a back stair to a waiting van. Reporters and families filled the front steps of the courthouse, but he went out the rear, past the trash bins where no camera waited. A clerk up in the office added a final sheet to his case file, noting the terms: multiple life sentences, no parole review for at least 40 years. The ride to the state unit took half a day. Flatland rolled by outside the barred windows, the same country he had crossed for decades in a work truck. Now he sat in a gray jumpsuit, wrists locked, ankles shackled to a steel ring on the floor. Intake officers met the van at a heavy gate, checked names, and walked the chain line through metal doors that shut like vaults behind them. Under harsh lights, Miguel stood for photographs and fingerprints. A nurse checked his blood pressure and wrote down the old scars from shrapnel and work. A counselor asked simple questions about war, drinking, and family. Each answer went onto a form. When the process ended, the guard handed him a folded copy with a new label at the top: Inmate Salinas, Miguel. Years later, a researcher for a true crime book would hold that same intake sheet and see how neatly a lifetime had been reduced to boxes and numbers. Prison life settled into a narrow track. He woke to a buzzer, ate from a metal tray, and walked the yard in circles. Work duty sent him to the maintenance shop, where he fixed lights instead of pipelines. Tools felt right in his hands, even there. Some called him Pipe Man and told the story with a kind of rough awe. He did not brag. He said only that 9 men were dead because he had turned the water loose. Once a week, he sat in a small chapel with cinder-block walls painted soft beige. The chaplain, an older man with gentle eyes, kept notes after each talk in a thin folder labeled with Miguel's number. Miguel spoke more there than he did on the yard. He described Ignacio's kitchen table, the old map, and the day he saw Harlan's name on a copied line. He never cried, but his hands tightened when he said his father's work now lay in a state locker. In those talks, he did not ask for excuses. He said he knew every man he drowned by name, had watched some of them learn the trade. He also said the company would never again be able to claim that pattern as its own quiet asset. Courts, lawyers, and reporters now tied it to theft, fines, and death. The chaplain wrote in his notes that Miguel seemed to carry two truths at once: pride that he had forced the record to speak, and grief that he had done it through murder. Letters from Javi arrived every few months. They spoke of Teresa's health, of layoffs, of new digital systems that watched every valve and pump. Some leases tied to Pierce-style routes had been shut in or sold at a loss, tangled in suits. The old Salinas map stayed sealed in evidence, copied in black and white into binders that corporate safety trainers used as a warning slide. This is what happens when you ignore a complaint. In time, a writer with a tape recorder came to the chaplain's office. She had Miguel's intake file, the log pages, and photos of the rusty toolbox. She listened while he explained again why he chose valves over quartz. Inside the chaplain's office, the writer let Miguel's last words hang in the air. He had talked about valves and logs, but when he spoke of what came after, his voice had gone soft. He pictured faces more than gauges now. Widows at kitchen tables, children in school halls. Miguel said the maps in the evidence room had turned into checks and court letters for those families, but no paper could fill the empty chairs. That thought followed the writer back out through the gates. Later that month, she drove down a rutted lane to a faded single-wide trailer on the edge of town. The first widow she met, Lorna Hayes, had been married to a roughneck everyone called Buck. On his last morning, he kissed 3 kids on the tops of their heads and left for the safety meeting. After the drownings, his hard hat came home in a cardboard box. His boots did too. Every payday after that, the mailbox stayed light. Inside Lorna's living room, the carpet was thin and the couch sagged in the middle. On the paneled wall, framed photos showed Buck in better days, grinning in a ball cap, a baby on his knee. On a shelf sat a worn spiral notebook where Lorna had written short lines after the funeral. Some entries were only dates and one word: cried, angry, late. School papers for her youngest daughter were tucked between pages marked with notes about missed days and slipping grades. Her oldest boy, Ryan, had been 12 when his father did not come back. That fall, his name began to appear on the school's absence list. First a day, then a week. The writer later pulled those records and saw the slope, neat columns of dates, turning blank. Ryan started staying out late, then dropped out the year he should have finished. A few years on, his own file in the courthouse held words like possession and fight stacked near the Salinas case folders. Across town, Harlan Pierce's widow lived in a brick house that still showed boom-time hopes. The yard once held new sod and a swing set. By the time the writer visited, weeds pushed through the walk and one swing hung by a single chain. On the mantel, Harlan's portrait sat beside 2 framed clippings. One announced his tragic accident. The other reported Miguel's conviction. Harlan's sons had tried to build on their father's maps, but lawsuits and bad prices broke their plans. Company payout checks kept the house a little longer, but grief and anger did their own quiet work. One son left for the oil sands up north and rarely called. Another stayed, drifting through short jobs and longer stretches at the pool house. His name never left the county report pages. Their mother circled Miguel's face in every article she read and pressed the clippings into a drawer, a private file of blame that never brought her husband back. Back at the small Salinas house, fallout took another shape. Teresa picked up shifts at a laundry and cleaned offices at night. Javi caught day work where he could, but some foremen would not hire a man with that last name. Others did, yet watched him close,
waiting for trouble that never came. Neighbors brought casseroles at first, then grew tired of choosing sides. A few widows crossed the street rather than pass Teresa on the sidewalk. Still, those same logs and maps that sent Miguel away also funded small changes. Settlements paid for one girl's nursing classes, another boy's tool set. Bridges laid over an unhealed gap.
In the years after the trial, the town kept shrinking around the edges. Storefronts on Main Street went dark one by one, signs fading over empty rooms. Kids who had been babies at the time of the drownings grew up hearing the story as a half-whispered warning at kitchen tables. The oil patch still moved, but slower. Some rigs left, others sat stacked like dead insects beside the highway. A new set of troubles filled the space old jobs left behind: meth, pawn slips, and long commutes to bigger cities for anyone who could still find steady work. Out past the last houses, Pump Station 17 rusted into the landscape. One tank was cut up for scrap, yet the low concrete rooms stayed in place, sealed and silent. Weeds grew tall around the fence. A twisted rail on the old ladder in the sump room stayed bent from the night it was shaken loose. Warning signs told folks to keep out, though teenagers sometimes slipped through the gap to dare each other to stand in the dark doorway. For them, it was only a ghost story place. For older hands, it stayed a scar. 20 years on, a regional TV station in Midland decided to air an anniversary special. Ratings were flat, and the producer thought a 20 years since the Pipeline Massacre show might pull people back. Inside a cool, windowless editing bay, fluorescent lights hummed over shelves of tapes and hard drives. A young reporter spread folders across a metal table: transcripts, black and white photos of the flooded stairwell, copies of Dr. Ellis's first report, and the same style of flow logs Miguel once folded under his arm. A fax from the Ranger archive granted permission to quote the old case file. The producer marked a shot list with a red pen. First, wide shots of the empty station and the weed-choked drainage channel. Next, grainy 80s stills of men in hard hats. Then a close-up of the steel toolbox opened on an evidence table. A graphic artist turned one key SCADA log into a moving line on screen, pressure rising in bright red in the minutes before the room filled. In the script outline, a note in the margin said, "Show how the data told the truth when people looked away." That idea shaped the segment even when the exact words were cut. By then, changes had spread through the wider industry. New rules required extra ladders and escape doors in low rooms. Automatic alarms shut valves if water rose where it should not. Safety trainers in distant states used a short case study called the Salinas incident. On one slide, a copy of the very log page the ranger had circled filled the screen, arrows pointing at timestamps and valve codes. In classrooms and trailer break rooms, instructors told new crews that every shortcut left a mark and that machines would remember when people tried to forget. Back in Miguel's home county, feelings stayed mixed. Some families sat through those trainings and watched their loss turned into bullet points and stock photos. Younger hands shifted in their seats, half bored, half uneasy, as the narrator on the TV talked about legacy, theft, and murder. Old-timers in diner booths said the video left out the part where nobody in power listened to Miguel's first complaint. Others answered that no slight could ever balance 9 coffins. Online, the station's clip lived on as one more grim story in a long feed, while the real pump station slowly sank into dust and silence at the edge of town forever. In a quiet room at Ranger headquarters, rows of gray file cabinets hold stories no one wants to live through twice. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead. Dust hangs in the air. On one metal table lies a declassified summary memo stamped with the case name, Salinas, Miguel, Pipeline Homicides. It is only a few pages long, written in dry, careful language, yet inside it sits the heart of this tale. The memo breaks the event into parts. First, an honor claim, a family routing map and method that never had a patent or title, only memory and trust. Next, an economic squeeze, falling oil prices, debt, layoffs, and side deals that blurred lines between legal and not. Then, a theft, a partner who took that unwritten map, sold it, and spread it to men hunting for a way out. Finally, a response, a foreman who turned his skill and the company's own machines into tools of punishment. The writer of the memo calls it a vigilante action facilitated by technical access. That is one way to frame it. For people who grew up where a man's word still feels like law, it can sound thinner than paper. To them, Miguel did what fathers and grandfathers had always promised in low voices: protect the family's name and work when no one else would. Yet the same pages hold the names of 9 men who never signed off on that old promise. Some helped pass the stolen grid, some only followed orders or chased a paid shift. All of them drowned in the dark while machines hummed above their heads. If justice means a response that fits the harm, can anything about that night fit? Miguel's tech countermeasure did work in one sense. The logs, maps, and toolbox he left behind forced the system to see what had been easy to ignore. Harlan's theft stopped being just bar talk. It became fact in court records and fine notices. The Salinas map could no longer be used in quiet, clean profit. Any line matching its bends now came wrapped in words like liability and case history. But each gain carried its own loss. The legacy Miguel tried to guard did not end up in his son's hands, passed over supper in a warm kitchen. It ended up inside plastic sleeves in an evidence room. Lawyers and trainers use copies as warnings. Young workers hear the name Salinas pattern and think first of risk, not craft. The memo's last lines note that improved safety rules and digital checks followed the case. Valves now shut on their own. Sump rooms have extra ladders. More eyes read flow reports. System changes grew from the blood at Station 17. Still, the deeper forces that pushed Harlan and Miguel together in that cramped trailer remain. Distant owners, thin margins, pride, fear of being erased. So this story sits in a gray space between 2 codes. One says no man has the right to kill outside the law, no matter the slight. The other says no outsider has the right to walk off with a family's only inheritance and expect nothing in return. The records in this room show how those codes collided when nothing stronger stood between them. Seen through this memo, Miguel is neither pure hero nor simple monster. He was a man who chose a final, bloody way to force notice of a wound no one else would name. The system he hated had to write his truth down, but it also had to write his crimes beside it, leaving the rest to you to judge. Years later, the Salinas files sat in a cardboard box on a rolling cart, waiting to be scanned. A young clerk, born long after 1987, lifted each page with gloved hands. To her, it was just another dark case number. She did not know the sound of a pump starting at midnight or the way crude dust tastes on wind. Still, one item held her eyes, a thin copy of Ignacio's hand-drawn map, pencil lines faded, notes cramped in the margins. She watched it slide under the scanner light and thought it looked like veins across a dry body. Out on the county edge, Pump Station 17 crouched in weeds and rust. The main line had been rerouted years ago, leaving one dented tank and a pad of cracked concrete. The sump room stayed sealed, its bent ladder eaten by time. Wind rattled loose tin and a faded danger sign. Some nights, pickup headlights cut across the fence as teenagers dared each other to slip inside. They left beer cans on the steps and carved names into the painted walls, never knowing where the water had once stood over hard hats and open mouths. They gave the place new names: the Blood Pump, the Drowning House, the Station of Ghosts. Stories drifted through school halls and back seats. One tale said you could hear boots on the stairs whenever thunder rolled. Another promised a hidden map that could make a man rich if he was brave enough to steal it. None of those kids had known the 9 Roughnecks or Harlan. To them, Miguel was a half-seen figure in grainy photos, not a man who once wiped sweat from his eyes and saved a herd from a burning leak. Far from that fence, in a modest home studio, foam on the walls and a thrifted lamp by the mic, a woman in her 40s recorded this very story for her channel. Printouts from the case lay on her desk beside a rough sketch of Station 17 and a clean copy of the Salinas map pulled from public records. She spoke into the microphone about honor, theft, and the night water rose over 9 men. Her viewers lived in Texas, Kentucky, West Virginia, Ontario, small places where folks still swap family recipes and land tales like currency. She phoned an older man named Javi for one last voice. He lived now near a different patch of rigs, in a rental with thin walls and a view of power lines. His knees hurt when rain moved in. Work came and went. Javi told her the real map, with Ignacio's pencil and Miguel's pen, still lay in state evidence, yellowing in plastic. He kept a small copy, redrawn from memory, folded inside a worn Bible. Some nights he traced its curves with one finger, not planning wells, just reminding himself that his people once understood how that ground breathed. She ended her episode with a pause, letting the room stay quiet before the music. Here is where the story leaves Miguel and lands with you. You have walked from his father's kitchen table to the flooded room at Station 17, from a folded map to a life sentence. You have seen how a stolen way of working the land can twist love and fear into something deadly. So in your own county, with your own family name, if the only thing you inherited was a recipe or ridge map and someone took it while the law shrugged, how far would you go? Would you trust courts or your hands? Tell us in the comments.